Our next speaker is Zanna van Loon. She is curator of rare books and manuscripts at the Museum Plantin-Moretus in Antwerp. Her research interests include the materiality and sociality of the early printed book, book trade networks, and print culture. She previously worked as the expert on analytical bibliography and as the project leader of STCV, Bibliography of the Handpressed Book, the online and open access bibliography of early modern books printed in the southern Netherlands. In 2020, she obtained a PhD in early modern history at the KU Leuven on the social and material characteristics of early modern missionary manuscripts and printed books on indigenous languages of North and South America. In 2024, her monograph titled The Early Modern Production of Missionary Books on Indigenous Languages in New Spain and Peru was published. She is a member of the editorial board of the journal The Golden Compasses. Today, she will take us to the archives of the Museum Plantin-Moretus, and she has found some bookbinders in there. Zanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, for the nice introduction. Before I start, I want to make sure that the research that I'm conducting now is happening together with Nicholas Pickwood. So if there are any questions regarding technical terms, I invite Nicholas to join in the discussion afterwards to take care of those. Because I'm not a bookbinding specialist, I'm a book historian. So I'm actually also looking at these book bindings or bookbinding practices from a historical perspective based on the archive in Museum Plantin-Moretus. I would like to also mention that a large part of this presentation has already been presented at another virtual workshop called Turning Pages, just to make sure that people are following in the hopes that I have some new insights. That is not the case. So I will be presenting my earlier work because it's still an ongoing research project. I would like to start with this quote that I found in Adam Smith's The Bookmaker's Book. It's a book for a wide audience, but it's a very interesting book. So if you've not read it before, I do recommend it. And there's a chapter on William Wildgoose, a bookbinder in Oxford. As an introduction, he mentions this, that the whole class of skilled workers that bookbinders are, have all vanished from the historical record, to say actually that we don't know a lot about the people who were actually binding these different bindings that we still have. So most of the research today obviously happens on the bindings that we can examine, but who the people were behind those bindings, that information is only available scarcely. Fortunately, we have Museum Plantin-Moretus with the extensive business archive of the printing office, the Officina Plantiniana, that includes also information on transactions made with bookbinders, hence this presentation. So how do we trace the hidden trade when it comes to bookbinding in Antwerp? Well, the answer is here. The Officina Plantiniana and the rich archive that it has. So it's also a bit of a promotional talk. If people are interested in bookbinding research, it's a good start in Antwerp to visit the archive and to study these documents. But who then, or the Officina Plantiniana, for the people who don't know the printing office, it was founded by Christophe Plantin. He was a Frenchman who learned the trade of printing in France and then migrated to Antwerp. And we all know in 1555 started his printing business. But before he actually started printing, he was a bookbinder, a very good bookbinder with a good reputation. And he was trained in the bookbinding business by Robert II Massé in Cayenne in France. And we know Christophe Plantin for the luxurious bindings that he bound. And he's also known to have decorated mirrors, cabinets, and chests. we know a lot about his binding practices based on the archive, again, that is preserved in Museum Plantin-Moretus. And the archive, based on this archive, we can assume that he continued binding books until at least 1561. So even when he started his printing business in 1555, he continued his bookbinding practices up until the 1560s. These are two examples that we have in our collection that are attributed to Christophe Plantin as a bookbinder. On your left, it's a very elaborate binding in a French style. So it's really for a high-end customer. For who it was, we actually don't know, because the médaillon that seems to have contained some information, maybe a coat of arms, has really been wiped away through the time. This is also a book printed on blue paper. It was printed by Christophe Plantin, but published by one of his colleagues in Antwerp, Jean Belair. So here, already in the beginning, he's combining the printing and the binding business. And then on your right, this is one of our latest acquisitions in the museum. It's more of a simple binding. It contains gold tooling and a panel stamp in the middle. This book, it's a chronicle of Calvete de Estrella, of his journey in the Low Countries. And he donated this copy of a book to Federico Badour, who was the Venetian ambassador. So this is a presentation copy. And based on the tooling used in the binding, it's attributed to Christophe Plantin. Also, so as I mentioned before, we can find traces in our archive that mention Plantin's work as a bookbinder, in his own ledgers, documenting transactions that he made with Antwerp colleagues. This is, for instance, one of the first transactions made for Jan Steelsius, who is an Antwerp colleague. And as you can see, it mentions in French, of course, because Plantin was a Frenchman, how he was being paid for pour la reliure de 2 heures en marocain, so for the binding of 2 book of hours in Marocain. And then it continues with other mentions of bindings that he was commissioned to do. And then there's another trace, actually. So when he started his printing business in 1555, Plantin really wanted to make sure that his employees were doing what they were supposed to be doing, and he printed the regulations for his employees in the printing office, which he then hung up on the wall, so that they all knew what was expected of them. And one of the last rules of this document mentions that the bookbinders or the apprentices are not allowed in the printing office if they have nothing to do there, on the punishment of, or they were sentenced to the lash if they would enter the printing office. So this small remark in this printed regulation reveals that at this point in time, Christophe Plantin had a binding workshop in the same building where his printing office was, where he had bookbinders working for him. Then Christophe Plantin was actually due to, it would lead me too far to explain why, but due to some financial and political issues, he was forced to sell his entire or most of his possessions during a public auction on the Vrijdagmarkt. And we see in the inventory that was made of the goods that he was supposed to sell, that this also included some of his bookbinding materials. And it's also from this point onwards that a company is founded to take care of administration, to take care of the organization of the printing office, that we also see a shift of focus of Plantin on the printing of books, the publishing of books, and bookselling on its own. And from this moment onwards, we also see that he starts relying on commissions to have books bound by local bookbinders in Antwerp instead of commissioning the bookbinders in his own printing office. But then there's this strange archival document containing purchases made for the printing office that includes in 1563 and 1564 a couple of bookbinding materials, including 4 stamps that contain the golden compass, which was the printer's mark of Plantin in his printing office, and also like a large bookbinding press, a roll stamp, and other stuff is mentioned in these documents. Where they ended up to be, we actually don't know. What we do have are some extant examples of the tools being used on bindings still in our collection. So the 4 marques au compas de cuivre pour mettre sur le cuir avec le devise Laboreat Constantia can be identified as the stamps of tooling in the middle that you see in the middle of these bindings. Anyway, then the printing office, as you may know, continued to exist for 3 centuries. So after Plantin, it was succeeded by his son-in-law, Jan Moretus, and the family Moretus continued on printing until 1876. And the good news is, as I've already mentioned a couple of times, their complete business administration is still extant, allowing us to really make visible information on different practices in this company over 3 centuries long. This also then includes journals and ledgers documenting the collaborations that the printing office had with local bookbinders. And the amount of information to be found in these ledgers is very, very extensive, but not always as systematic as you will see at the end of my presentation. Important to note here is we obviously also still preserve the journals and ledgers made for clients buying books in the printing office, revealing to us that customers did not only bought books unbound, but that there was actually a varied choice of customers buying books unbound, but also bound already. So it was not always the case that customers went up to the printing office, bought books unbound, and then had their books bound themselves at the local bookbinding workshops. And this is an example of an individual client, not a professional client, Alan Cope, who ordered a number of books in 1566. And you see in his order that it is specified whether the book is bound or not. And just to make the terminology a bit more comprehensible, I've explained what the abbreviations mean. So if the book is unbound, it would say blanc in French. And then if it would be bound, it can be noted down as just unspecified. It was bound, a binding, or what material that was used, like calfskin or sheepskin, or that was bound in parchment. This then applies to individual customers, but also to booksellers. Again, this is an order made by Nicholas England. He's a London bookseller who came to Antwerp to order a number of books. And even he bought some books that were bound and not just only books unbound to bring them with them to London. But the most important archival documents that I've consulted to do this research are the ledgers that really record the transactions made with the local bookbinders. These documents start in 1564, and they're actually very lively documents. you really see that these documents have been used in a busy and chaotic printing office. We can find a lot of scraps of paper in between them used as bookmarks. For instance, in the middle, you see even a part of a printed almanac being used as a bookmark. Also some notes related to orders for bookbinding, or some, as you see on the right, or on the left, you see even calculations made on a scrap of paper. That it was actually a ledger used in the printing office. You can see on the bottom, somebody spilled some printing ink. And also it sometimes even contains pages or quires of editions printed in the printing office. As you can see on the right, which was very intriguing to find. But what information can we find in these ledgers regarding the Antwerp bookbinders? First of all, that there is a very large number of bookbinders that were in contact with the Officina Plantiniana, and that there was no, that it's not that the Officina selected a selected number of bookbinders to commission, but they really made use of the network or the community that was there. And about this network, it was a close-knit network. The archive in, sorry, was that a question or? Oh, okay. The network, the information that we find in these archival documents reveal already that bookbinders were closely connected to each other. They were family members, or they were in some way dependent on the printing office. The orders also reveal identifying information about the people actually binding, and what their work was. And also that women were involved in these workshops, binding, and not just as widows. And what will follow here is a lot of examples, a lot of visual material, which is nice to look at, I think. This is a table made for just 1 year. It's the first year that Plantin relied on a separate ledger to record transactions for bookbinders. And in this 1 year, you see 21 different bookbinders being mentioned as being commissioned by Christophe Plantin. In some cases, I was able to find their surnames, because it's important to mention many of these people mentioned were not mentioned with their surnames, which implies that they were so well known in their business that it was enough to mention Remy as Remy. You did not need to know his last name. It was Remy, the bookbinder. And in some cases, I even was unable up till now to identify their surname, their last name, like Laurent. Because they were so well known, they were never recorded with their surname. Sometimes Plantin and the people who wrote down these in these ledgers mention the street where these people were located, and you really see what was expected, that it's all close by. It's really in a network. Which is the same for the bookselling business. It's close to the printing office as well. And some people were also neighbors. This is all not very exciting news. It's known in Antwerp that there were different parts of the city where groups or different trades really came together. And then I've put 2 names in bold because it concerns women who are mentioned without the name of their husbands. And they were actually also binding for Christophe Plantin. And we know their names because their names are recorded as such in the archival documents. So now the examples. The example on top is of a bookbinder called Jacques Beukelaer. Jacques Beukelaer did a lot for the Officina Plantiniana in the 17th century, so after Christoph Plantin. And what this reveals is actually he was renting a house of the Moretus family to open his own workshop. This is not an isolated case. There are many more bookbinders who were actually living in houses rented by the Officina Plantiniana, which also shows some sort of reliance on the printing office. Then the second example, this is Huybrecht. Huybrecht's mentioned in an order. It's identifies his location. So he's mentioned as a bookbinder, but the order also mentions that he's located in the Heilige Geeststraat, in the house called the Kluizenaar. The Heilige Geeststraat is actually the street right next to the printing office on the Vrijdagmarkt. So where the museum still is today, if you enter the reading room, it's that street where this bookbinder was located. Also in a house he rented from the printing office. Sometimes the ledgers provide information on the roles that these men took up in the guilds. For instance, this was the alderman of the bookbinders of Antwerp. And so it was important for the printing office to mention him as such. Then second, the high regularity, the frequency of the orders that were made is made visible by this slide. So Remy de la Motte, he was a bookbinder from the early days onwards. He was binding for Christoph Plantin, and you see that he was frequently ordered to provide bindings on a frequent basis, almost weekly sometimes. But most of the time it was monthly. Then in some cases, it mentions how there were specialized trades like the book clasp makers. This is Hans de Laat. He was actually the brother-in-law of Jacques de Beukelaer, who we saw earlier, really showing that this was part of this family network as well. And also here you see how most of the times he's just mentioned with his first name, Hans. So it was enough to write him down as Hans, the book clasp maker. And this is an example of an order made for Lenke van den Brille. She was a woman. And she's not mentioned with a husband, which usually happens if it concerns booksellers or printers. There's always a relation to a man. And in this case, it's not, it just mentions the order that has been made for a couple of books to be bound in parchment and a couple of books to be bound in calfskin. This is also related to an order related to a woman, and this is how you really see that these bookbinding workshops as printing offices were really family companies. Everybody was involved. This is normal in the early modern period, but here you can see it made tangible in the sources. It says that the wife of Remy, the bookbinder, paid for the binding, was paid for the binding of 12 divernales and other bindings related here in the, or mentioned here in the order. What we also find of information in these archival documents are related to the types of bindings, or it really specifies how the bindings were supposed to be made. It includes information on cover material, on decoration, furniture, fastenings, and supralibros if it was necessary. And again, I will continue with some visual examples. On your left, you can see an order made. It's not even mentioned which books, but the books, it is made clear that the books were supposed to be bound in calfskin parchment, parchment de veau, but also in sheep's skin parchment, parchment de mouton. And then on your right, you see an order made how 2 adagia of Erasmus were supposed to be bound in Moroccan leather from Turkey that was supposed to be doré, or also gilded on the edges. Then the example on top relates to blind tooling. You see one Bible, una Biblia, and it mentions how it has to contain tooling, affilé, and also clasps, ferment, and furniture, the corners, the hoeken made of copper, hoeken van koper. And then the second example is actually very interesting. It mentions how one particular book written by Cornelius Alapete was supposed to be bound in a binding with wooden boards, and it says op zijn Hollands, which means in Holland style. Actually allows us to reflect on to what extent bindings are have geographic related styles. This reveals that it was possible to have your book bound in Antwerp in Holland style. So in what sense can we tell us something about these bindings if we see a binding in a Holland style, that it was actually bound in Holland? And then the last example, the second book mentioned says that it's bound in red leather, again, roodleer with blind tooling. Here another transaction that mentions fastenings, the fastenings, de voor salteria met riemen, that means with the fastening, and also noppen, the furniture on the sides. These examples relate to names included in the binding. The first one, you see 44 boeken or books where a coat of arms was placed on it. It says literally a weapon has been set upon it. Then the second example says that one of the bookbinders was paid for the effort of to have put actual letters on the binding. It mentions the initials PCB. And the final example, you see one Horace, where there was a name placed on it, if I would translate it literally from the Dutch to English. Then in these archival documents, we also find information on actual binding practices. So not just how the binding would look like. We see that the bookbinders were not only commissioned to do the regular work, but also that they were supposed to do some additional jobs. We see that if they would use medieval manuscript fragments as covers, it is specified, so it was a deliberate choice, probably related to costs. And also, of course, not surprising that there's a correlation between particular editions and a type of binding, and also some general jobs. Again, some examples. The first example shows a ream of paper that has been cut, the third line, raam de papier coupé. In the second example, you see how the binder was paid to have folded and beaten several of the books commissioned. And then the final example says how one book on the second line in quarto has been sewn. Then this example for Hubert, the bookbinder, it says on the 19th of February, he was paid for the use of vieil parchment, or this, the medieval manuscript fragment. It's really specified. This is something that comes occasionally in these orders. And then finally, this is also interesting. This is an order for Jean Molin's, Jean Molin, and it contains the mention of a ream of paper that has been cut all around. but also that 550 astrolabia have been glued upon. And actually in a previous presentation, someone that I was in contact with, she identified it as the practice of volvellus that were actually glued in printed editions. So 550 separate volvellus that had been glued by this particular binder. It is very clear looking at all these transactions that the Officina Plantiniana really was at the center of a whole network, and that they were actually, the master printers were actually an important part of this network, not only to give work to these bookbinders, but also to supply resources, paper, animal skins, etc. There were a lot of commissions for the bookshop of the Officina Plantiniana, and not just for their own editions. So books that they had bought unbound, they commissioned the bookbinders to have them bound so they could sell them in their bookshop or to other to customers on in other ways. And it's also very visible that they were acting as intermediaries for individual customers and for booksellers, so that they were the trade agent through which customers would also have their books bound. And as I mentioned before, some of these bookbinders were tenants of the printing office. Again, some examples. Cornelius' Book was a bookbinder as well. His name wasn't actually Book. It was a nickname given to him. His actual surname was Olivier's, but apparently his reputation was so well that he was named Book in the records. And here you see that the printing office acts as a middleman for the delivery of animal skins for Cornelis' Book. This is an example of how in the order it mentions not just books from the Officina are being bound, the 27 ones, it says the Notre Impression, so from our imprints, but also the line above, it says 7 livres de Paris, so 7 books of Paris were also bound in a particular way. Really making sure that they had a supply of books to sell in the bookshop and to Frankfurt and other canals. Interestingly, if individual clients were buying books in a printing office unbound, they often asked the printing office to have them bound as well. This is a general order made in 1566, and maybe 5 books in the order are being gilded and embossed for Monsieur Zaya. That's Gabriel Zayas. He was the secretary to the Spanish King Philip II. Another example for the bookbinder Jean Mollet, with books being bound for Arias Montanus, who was the Spanish theologian responsible for the Polyglot Bible. And this example is also interesting. So a list of books, and in the margins it mentions that it's that these books should be bound in a yellow-red leather with the name on the spine of the customer, and that name is F. Barreto. And of course, not just for their customers, they also had books bound for their own library. This is an order of books for Balthazar II Moretus. And as you can see, not a lot of information except for, the title of the book. You can also see the author's name, and the way of binding is limited to the mention of P and then V, that stands for parchment veau. So these books were bound in calfskin parchment. The list continues here. Again, you see the name of the author, the title, and the parchment vol. This was an order made for Gilles Boon, the Antwerp bookbinder. And because this was for Balthazar-Moretus, I thought it may be worthwhile to check our collection that still contains the family library to see if some of these books are still extant in our collection. And very interesting, from the 10 books that are mentioned, or the 15 books, I'm not sure, I should count, all of them match up to books in our collection, and they are all, except one, bound in the exact same way. And Nicholas, who can maybe elaborate on this during the discussion, has confirmed that all of these books looking like this are bound in the same workshop. So they all contain this parchment cover with the green edges. And it's very clear that there's one workshop responsible for the binding of these books. And if we then look at the archive, we can confirm it was Gilles Boon who bound, or Gilles, his workshop, who bound these books. To conclude, first of all, it's clear that the printing office had a varied supply of ready-to-sell books, both unbound with run-of-the-mill, very standard bindings, but also quality bindings in stock. And it's this variety that was important to meet the demands of different customers, the different demands of customers. It's also very clear that there was a large interdependence between the printing office and the local bookbinding industry. The Officina really relied on these commissions for the bookbinders. They needed to have at least a part of their stock bound to sell them in this way. And also that this business archive really reveals so much information about how bookbinders approach their work and what their connection was with a local printing office. At least that depends on the information that the archives gives us. It's not always as systematic, so I would like to conclude with this one. In an order made in the 17th century, the person noting down the transaction forgot actually to write down what the price was of what he was writing down, and he literally writes in Dutch, vergeten te schrijven, which means I forgot it. I forgot to write this down. So thank you.